Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Brooks Pierce Labor and Employment Law webinar. This month, we're talking about returning to the workplace and giving you some legal perspectives on that. I am joined today with my colleague, Elizabeth Troutman. I'm Natalie Sanders. We are both labor and employment attorneys with Brooks Pierce, and we're glad to have so many of you here to talk about this today. First, we need to give you a little disclaimer, as lawyers do. Please keep in mind that what we are providing for you here today is generalized information. We are not attempting to provide you legal advice, and this should not be used as a substitute for consulting your own attorney about your specific situation. So to start us off, let's get us in the mood for returning to work by watching this little clip.
Babe, they're gonna let us all work from home. Yeah, I know, it's like a dream come true, right? Oh, I'm gonna get to spend so much time with you and the kids. We're gonna save so much money. Lunch, parking, gas. Oh, babe, my commute. You wanna see my new commute to work? At work. Traffic was light this morning. This is gonna be like a vacation. I'm gonna put my shorts on. Hey babe, can I set up my desk here? I'll just be a lot more productive if I have a designated work area. Oh, not too bad, huh? There we go. That looks like a productive space, huh? Can't be productive without some good old bean water. Oh, I wonder if my printer would fit in there. We still have that old printer? There we go. Look at that. All right, what do you think, guys? That's a productive looking workstation, huh? Babe, I am not procrastinating. I just know with the proper setup, I'm gonna be way more productive. Hey, it's Daddy's turn. Dude, this thing is awesome. Okay, Daddy's gonna paint with you real quick and then I gotta go back to work. Scoot with you for a little bit and then I gotta go back to work. Oh, hey, Mom. No, I can talk for a bit, but then I gotta go back to work. Hey, babe, can you keep the kids out of my work area? I just have a lot of emails to get through. Are those new shorts? No, they look good. So, you home all afternoon, or? Are you kidding me? Of course Carol Baskin did it. Babe, come look at this house I found in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm just looking. I just don't want to be one of those husbands that puts his work before his wife. So, if you need something, I'm home all day. Guys, can you turn it down? Can you get down? Babe, can you please turn Lauren Daigle down? I can't think. I know she's the voice of our generation. That's why I can't think. I get sucked in. Cynthia, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. No, you have to turn your mic on. Preferences? Go up to You don't need magenta. I'm printing black and white. I can see you. Can you guys see me? I'm trying to make lunch for my kids. Ah, crap. It's not on me. You scheduled a meeting in the middle of lunch. I'm gonna put something on. Just hold on. Hold on, guys. I can't hear you. I just need a quiet place to work. Cynthia, turn on your mic. Boomers. When I think I'm weak. And send. Actually got a lot done. Babe.
So we're hoping that we're getting close to stage 6, which would be the return to the workplace. And that's what we're going to talk about. But I think all of us have experienced some of these frustrations and some of these stages in working from home. I want to make one point here, though, before we dive into this topic, and that is in North Carolina, keep in mind that the latest guidance that's still on the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services website says that employers are encouraged to provide work from home or remote work wherever possible. So that hasn't yet changed in North Carolina. So if you're thinking about getting people back to work, the situation is this: if there is a real need for it, if it's not possible, it's not practical, something has changed, there are things that haven't been getting done that we've been letting go because of the pandemic, we need to get back to doing them. Those are justifications. But The guidance still says in North Carolina, as much as possible, remote work. We expect that to be changing very soon. Governor Cooper talked to us about eliminating a lot of the restrictions in June, hopefully announcing something for June 1st, but we're not quite there yet. So this is good timing because hopefully you all are planning, but we're not quite there yet. All right, so what are we going to do today? We thought the best way to address this would be put ourselves in your shoes as the employer. You're going to tell everybody, we're coming back to the office. What kind of responses are you going to be getting? And these are the things that we came up with based on some of the things we're hearing from some of our clients and just a little brainstorming that we did. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to talk about the first two of these. I'm ready to return. You know, I'm the person in the video. I'm done. Let me get back to that office. What do I need to know? The other question, I'm a bit reluctant to return. How are you going to make sure I'm safe if I come back? I put these two together because they're very similar in what the answer is. And actually, we talked a lot about it last month. We did a webinar last month about OSHA. We were kind of expecting OSHA to issue some actual emergency temporary standards for the workplace in response to COVID, and they hadn't yet. They still have not. So the information that we provided there was based on OSHA's guidance document. So it's not a requirement, but they did provide updated guidance in January. And we think that's still the best approach for you preparing your workplace for the employees coming back. So what will they need to know and how are you going to protect them? Well, follow that guidance. It talks about setting up a COVID-19 prevention program. And I'm not going to rehash the prior webinar that we did. You can go see it, but I put a few of the slides in here and I'll focus you just on a couple little points. First off, they really do encourage you to involve the employees in getting feedback and what this is going to look like. They very much focus on the use of face coverings and social distancing. And I'll make one comment about social distancing. It's still 6 feet. There's been some confusion that maybe it's 3 feet, and that was in response to schools being allowed to put desks 3 feet apart in order to get kids back into the schools. They couldn't get them back in if they had to keep them 6 feet apart. But that didn't change what it means for us to social distance in the workplace or what a close contact exposure means. That's all still based on 6 feet. Another point that I will emphasize as you're putting together a COVID-19 prevention protection plan, you want to make sure to educate and train the employees. That's one of the key elements in all of this OSHA guidance, is really giving good information and communicating with the employees. And then finally, they make a point of saying, don't distinguish between workers who are vaccinated and not vaccinated. The CDC says that there are things that vaccinated people can do together. And so this has created some confusion. But that guidance is not for the workplace. If you look at the CDC guidance on what you can do if you've been vaccinated, it's talking about private settings. It's talking about who you can have in your home, who you can be around without a mask. But that doesn't apply to our workplaces that are still considered a public place. At this point, we don't have any guidance to indicate that anyone, vaccinated or not, should be without a mask in the workplace. And even in some outside settings, because I know the CDC did issue some just the other day saying that we don't need our masks outside in a lot of circumstances. Again, that's not applying to our workplace setting. All right. Question 3, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
All right. So question number 3 kind of piggies back on some of what Natalie was talking about. I'm reluctant to return to the workplace. Are you going to make sure everybody is vaccinated? And so this poses a question for us as employers. Can you mandate that employees be vaccinated? And then should you mandate that employees be vaccinated? This is probably the most frequently asked question of the last couple weeks. And I will say that the guidance is constantly changing in this area. So I think it's really important that you consider this question carefully. So the EOC has come out and said, yes, employers can require employees to be vaccinated, but they must provide reasonable accommodations to that requirement for employees with disabilities and employees with sincerely held religious beliefs. So no, you cannot guarantee that every employee will be vaccinated. And so then you start getting into this question of, well, what's the right choice for my workplace? Should I be requiring all the employees to be vaccinated? And will that actually make everyone safer? And to answer that question, I really urge you to think about why it is that you want to mandate vaccination for your employees. What guidance from the CDC or some other industry standard are you looking at to determine that? How are you going to accommodate people with disabilities and different religious beliefs? And will this actually make things safer? And I urge you to contact your attorney, frankly, to deal with this question, because it is pretty complicated in how you roll this out and really dependent on the type of workplace that you have. One thing that a lot of employers are doing are incentive programs and to encourage people to get vaccinated, but not absolutely requiring it. I do think this is a little bit easier to administer. And we had a webinar a few months back just going through this question about mandatory vaccination and how to set up incentive programs. So I urge you to look back at that as well. Go to the next slide. And so along these lines around, are you going to make sure everybody's vaccinated, comes the question, well, how are we going to know who's vaccinated and who's not? And again, the EEOC has kind of put us in a cul-de-sac. They say proof of vaccination and the question, are you vaccinated, are not medical inquiries. And that's important because as many of you probably realize, the ADA has restrictions on what medical inquiries you can ask. What can you ask employees about their private medical information? So you can ask an employee, are you vaccinated? You can ask an employee for proof of vaccination. But beyond that, you're going to run into this medical inquiry issue. So if they say no, and then you say, well, why not? You're asking a medical question there. And so I think you have to think carefully about why you need the information. And again, talk to your attorney to develop a program that works for your workplace. One valid reason would be we need to consider who is exposed to the virus to determine who's going to be excluded from the workplace. Because a fully vaccinated person who has no symptoms does not need to be excluded if they have no symptoms. So that might be one reason, but again, it's going to depend on your workplace and whether you need to have that kind of information readily available or not. And then this question of sharing vaccination status. And so we've heard of folks, wanting to go be very public about who's vaccinated and who's not, and just telling you that that's not appropriate. This is something that is private to individuals. If people are not getting vaccinated, it may be because they have a underlying health condition or disability of some kind that prevents them from being able to be vaccinated, and you could run into all kinds of discrimination issues by being public with who is vaccinated and who is not. So next slide. So back to the question that you might get asked. I'm reluctant to return. Are you going to make sure everybody is vaccinated? Here's some ways that you can answer that question. If you are mandating the vaccine, then you can say we are mandating the vaccine, but we are going to be providing accommodations to those who need it. And so, no, we cannot guarantee that every single person will be vaccinated. If you're not mandating the vaccine, then you might say, we're not mandating the vaccine. We encourage folks to get vaccinated, but what we're focused on is making sure that our workplace is safe. And here are all the other things that we are doing, all the other types of mitigation measures that we're putting in place to prevent the virus from spreading and making you safe. And then folks, are going to want to know, right? That because this happens in workplaces, I want to know who's vaccinated and who's not. And the answer to that is, I understand that you want to know that, but that's really private information. And, we're encouraging folks not to pressure each other to disclose that kind of private information about themselves. So if you'll go to the next slide. One way to
Elizabeth, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we had a question that probably fits right here. So I just wanted to throw it out. Someone's asking about, well, if we need to make these accommodations for a disability or religious reason, if they haven't gotten vaccinated, how do we inquire then? How do we know that?
Well, I really do think that this is going to depend on how you set up your vaccination program. And so there are a lot of different ways. One might be that if you are mandating the vaccine, to make sure that in your communications, you provide notice to folks if you have a disability, if you have a religious belief and want an accommodation, here's how you ask for one. And so that it's coming directly from the employee first, rather than, having to pry. And then we're going to talk a little bit later about the interactive process for employees with disabilities and how to tailor your medical questions to the disability in and of itself. But that's a great question because it's one of the major issues, I think, with mandating the vaccine from the get-go. Natalie, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with what you've said. It's very hard. There's really no reason that the employer should be asking why aren't you getting vaccinated, unless it is a mandate situation like you described, and then you make available to people the opportunity to bring it up themselves as a need for an accommodation. So I agree.
Yeah.
All right, I'll move you to the next slide.
All right. So we wanted to talk a little bit here about leave and COVID leave, just because the American Rescue Plan that was enacted about a month ago expanded reasons that employers can offer paid leave to employees to include getting the vaccine and recovering from the vaccine. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just how that law works. And if you want more information about that, certainly reach out. But the basic idea is back in March of 2020, there was a law enacted, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which you may remember, that required employers of 500 employees or less to offer two different types of leave. One was the 2 weeks of leave, emergency paid sick leave, and the other was 12 weeks of leave, Emergency Family Medical Leave Expansion Act. Okay, so we've got the 2-week kind and the 12-week kind. In December, Congress said, you know what? Employers can continue to offer that if they like and receive a tax credit for the paid leave that they offer. And so they extended that out until March 31st. The American Rescue Plan then extended it again So from April 1st until September 30th, employers can receive a tax credit if they offer these two different types of paid leave. And the other thing the American Rescue Plan did is it restarted the clock. So even if employees took some of this leave before starting April 1st, if you are an employer that's offering this type of paid leave, employees can take up to 80 hours under the type 1 emergency paid sick leave and up to 12 weeks of leave under the EFMLEA. There's a lot more nuances to those. So if you're going to implement a plan for that, I encourage you to reach out to a lawyer, but that's the basic concept. If you go to the next slide. So one of the reasons you might want to offer this leave is that it does provide a way to offer paid leave to employees who are out due to the vaccine. So the reasons that you can offer this leave are quarantine by government order, quarantine by advice of the healthcare provider. If an employee has symptoms and is seeking a diagnosis of COVID-19, seeking a diagnostic test because of exposure to COVID-19, getting the vaccine, recovering from any condition arising from the vaccine, at which, folks are struggling on some of these vaccines and do need that time. And it really is quite broad to include really any kind of reaction to the vaccine. And then taking care of a family member who has to be out for any of these reasons, an unavailability of childcare due to a school closure or the childcare provider is not available related to COVID-19. So all of those reasons are there. Come back and look at this slide when you're trying to figure out, how this leave works.
Hey, Elizabeth, we got another question that relates to this leave. I think it's a really good one because it's been confusing, but it's asking about the 80 hours of the paid emergency sick leave and whether or not that's total 180-hour chunk since we began this type of leave, or if it's a new 80 hours or when does it start. Can you talk about that?
It's a new 80 hours starting April 1st. So the American Rescue Plan changed this law a bit. The big thing it did was it started the clock over. So if you choose, this is a voluntary program, but if you choose, employees would have a fresh 80 hours from April 1st to September 30th. And that's for full-time employees. The other thing that the law did is it expanded the reasons, like we've talked about. And it said, look, if you offer the 12-week kind of leave, you offer it for all of the reasons. It used to be that 12-week leave was only available for childcare.
Great, thanks. I'll advance your slide now.
All right. So just a little example to help you think about this. If Eva, your employee, leaves early from work to get vaccinated, and then she has to be out for 2.5 days. So what would happen? If you have fewer than 500 employees and you have enacted this emergency paid sick leave, then you can get a tax credit for that time that she was out, and she would not use the paid time off or sick leave that you already offer. That's really important. You can't get a tax credit for them taking the leave that you've already got in place. This is additional leave. If you did not opt to offer the leave, then, the employee would take their, a paid leave that they already have, right? Their PTO. You could also consider letting them take that unpaid. So Natalie, next question up to you.
Great. You're giving me the easy one too. I don't want to return to the workplace. I'm doing fine working from home. We expect a lot of you are going to hear this. And that's because a SHRM study just recently done in February determined that 52% of our American workforce who's working from home say they would rather never return to the workplace. So we expect there are going to be a lot of people that are bringing this to your attention and asking, why can't I just work from home? So a little bit of practical advice to start off. Your gut reaction may be, no, get back to work. I would recommend, because there's going to be a lot of this and because there are a lot of nuances, consider some sort of middle ground. One of the suggestions I've been making is, why don't you suggest that we'll have an employee task force, or we'll have a group that's going to evaluate how did it actually work while we were working remotely, and then consider whether we'll have a remote work policy going forward that maybe creates some sort of blend. But we're not going to make that decision immediately. But it'll give your employees at least the idea that we're open to hearing, how did it in fact work? Why is it beneficial to the employees? Why is it beneficial to the company? So consider something like that as a practical matter. And then if you're going to let people work from home and continue, set a policy. This happened so fast for so many of us that there was no policy. This was we need to save lives. We need to not overwhelm our healthcare system. We have to put people into remote work situations, and we all did it. But it didn't mean that necessarily every person working from home is doing all aspects of their job. So we need to look at that. Doesn't mean that they're doing all aspects of their job in a secure, cyber secure fashion. Right? Doesn't mean that we've dotted all of our I's and crossed all of our T's. So if it's going to continue and it's no longer an emergency situation, we highly recommend that you go ahead and set a policy and take time to determine who's going to be eligible to work remotely. How are we going to ensure compliance with our policies when people are working remotely? One of the issues we've been hearing from the employer side about the remote work situation is, how do I maintain accountability? How do I make people understand that while it seems to them it's working, it's not working for us? We're having trouble getting things in the timely fashion that we used to, or we're having trouble overseeing their work, or we're having trouble getting the collaboration we were used to. Well, the reason that one person might think it's going great, but the employer doesn't, is that we don't have clear expectations and methodologies for maintaining that accountability. So think about how you're going to do that as a practical matter and get that into some policies. Think about timekeeping. That's going to look different whether you have exempt or non-exempt employees. Communicate clearly with employees, and how are you going to maintain communication with their coworkers and their supervisors? Might have to be more intentional, setting set times. Think about insurance and liability issues. Currently, OSHA's position is they're not going to examine offices at home and home work environments, but you still want to make sure you have your employees in a safe place, because workers' comp may come into play if they are injured in their work at home office. So how is all of that going to play out? And talk with your insurers, make sure you're reporting who's working from home and who's not. And then think about the equipment and the environment. As a general matter, if something's essential for them to perform their job, you probably should be providing it. And are you providing them that safe work environment? So there's a lot to think about if you're going to continue it, but is it actually required if they just say, I'm good, I'm not coming back? No, they don't get to choose, but you do have to take into consideration the accommodation issues. I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth to talk about that. And let me advance that slide for you, Elizabeth.
Sure. And I'm chuckling to myself because we sort of didn't put this one as a question. It was more a statement. I can't come back. I have a condition that puts me at high risk, period. And I think that you will get a lot of this as well. For those employers who have had a lot of folks back in the workplace throughout the pandemic, you may have already really gotten a good grapple on how the ADA works in this context. But for those of you who are really bringing people back for the first time, or groups of people back, this is an important framework to have in mind. So being high risk, quote unquote, for COVID-19 could mean that the employee has a disability, because the reasons that folks are high risk are generally related, or oftentimes related, to an underlying health condition of some kind, whether it be heart disease or cancer or diabetes, etc. And we'll provide you the list. The guidance is constantly changing. But the point is that if somebody says, look, I'm high risk, I can't come back in the workplace, then that really triggers an obligation for you to undertake an interactive process with the employee to understand how you might be able to accommodate them if they are a qualified person with a disability. So I'm going to walk you through some definitions. For some of you, this may be very familiar, but want you to just have it in your back pocket so that you can handle these situations, because there could be many of them. So what does the ADA require? It requires that employers provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities in order to perform the essential functions of their jobs, as so long as those accommodations do not pose an undue burden on the employer. Wow, those like 50 buzzwords in one sentence. So what's a disability? It's really, really broad. I think people don't realize this. It is any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Major life activities could include things like thinking, breathing, walking, right? Those are all major life activities. And so I think it's really easy for people to just say, oh, well, they're not in a wheelchair, they don't have a disability. That's not true. It's a really broad definition. And so a person who's high risk and their doctor is saying that because they have a heart condition, they should not be within 6 feet of other people at this time, they've got a physical impairment that substantially is limiting a major life activity. So that's how we get there with the high risk. A qualified individual means someone who can perform the essential functions of their job with or without reasonable accommodation. So there may be situations, and I say may because I think they end up being rare, but there may be situations where the person, even with accommodations, is not able to perform the essential functions of their job. And so that might be one area where you dig in and analyze what are those essential functions. So next slide. Okay, so how are we going to figure out if the person just says I'm high risk? How are we going to figure out what the situation is? How are we going to provide accommodations? And as I explained before, the ADA does prohibit employers from asking about medical information unless they have a legitimate reason to do so and the need for the accommodation is not obvious. The information that you request has to be tailored to what you're trying to discover. So in this context, I I think it's safe to say that it's not obvious what these different underlying health conditions, what the limitations of them are. And so it is okay to sit down with the employee and ask for medical documentation to show that the employee has a disability and to help you understand how to accommodate that disability. But you've got to ask questions that are just about the accommodation process. What can this employee do? Look at what their job is and ask questions about how you can accommodate that. And so you don't need to dig into every aspect of this condition that they have. You don't need to see their blood work, right? Um, and the other important thing here is that this information is private. And so you should only be getting the information in order to undertake this interactive process. You don't need to be sharing it with anyone. And one thing we see a lot of is that the employee comes to the supervisor first and says, I'm high risk, I can't come into work. And the supervisor tries to just deal with it or may start asking a bunch of medical questions. Supervisors don't need to have this information generally. And so training your supervisors to direct those inquiries to HR, to let the HR professionals who are trained in how to do this undertake that process. And then the supervisors can weigh in on what the plan is, but they don't need to have all that medical information. So next slide, we provided here just a list of all the CDC high-risk conditions as of, I think we pulled this on Monday. It's changing all the time, but just to kind of give you an idea, there are all these different ones. And my experience has been just dealing with this for the last year, how risky it is or what the employee can be exposed to or how we can accommodate them is really different, not just based on what condition they have, but where the employee is in that condition and what their doctor thinks is right. So you got to kind of dig into some of these, but wanted you to have this list so that you see people aren't just making it up that they're high risk. There are a lot of different ways in which a person can have a disability that entitles them to this interactive process and could ultimately entitle them to a reasonable accommodation. So next slide. So we should be on the interactive process. So this is where I just think it's important. Even, we started out saying, look, this is a pandemic, just be reasonable. And that's where we still are. We're in a pandemic. The interactive process is about being reasonable and trying to find a solution. So every employee who requests accommodations, you've got to undertake this interactive process. I think it's really easy because we've just been in this whole situation where we're constantly getting medical advice from the CDC or the news or wherever, that we all feel like we have this great understanding of people's medical conditions. You're the employer, you're not the doctor. So it's important that if a doctor says that the employee needs XYZ, there are ways that you can challenge that if you think it's, fraudulent or untrue. I'd say work with an attorney to do that. Don't just up and do that, because we really need to rely on the medical community to tell us, hey, this person can't be here or there or whatever. And vaccination does not automatically mean they are no longer at risk. It could, and that, is an area where you might ask questions of the medical provider to help you understand. It could also be that because of this condition, the person can't get vaccinated. So you've got to tailor the whole process and the accommodations to the employee's condition and the job that they are doing. The other piece of advice, general information I will provide is it's so important to document that you're undertaking this interactive process and that you're being reasonable with the employee. You do not have to provide the accommodations that the employee suggests, but you do have to work through the process and come up with solutions. So show that you're doing all of that. Keep that information and document it so that if something goes wrong at the end of the process, you've shown that you have really worked through this and justified whatever decisions that you've ended up making. So next slide. So what's reasonable and what's not? You know, there are so many different solutions here, and I urge you to be creative, but just throwing some down here so that you have this, you can go back to it if you're undertaking this process with an employee. And you can see, you know, job restructuring, moving an employee into part-time work, into different positions, you know, all kinds of adjustments and modifications could be appropriate. So next slide. You don't have to do things that are going to break the bank. And so, you know, an accommodation that is significantly difficult or significantly expensive for your organization is an undue hardship. And this is where you get at the very end of the process if you have not been able to come up with an accommodation that works. You may be at an undue hardship place. I think you need to be very careful about relying on the undue hardship. Again, I urge you to talk to a lawyer because what you're considering is the overall financial resources of the organization. And so you may say it's not possible, but when you compare that dollar figure to however much money you have that the organization is worth, that argument may not be as strong as you think. Maybe it just completely depends, like all of this ADA stuff, on the situation. So with all of that, it depends. I'll turn it back over to you. Maybe Natalie, you have some actual answers.
I'll try. This question may be easier. I can't come back to work. I have kids at home I have to supervise. This is one where you can ask the question, well, why do you have kids that need to be supervised? Or what supervision do they need? What's the reason? Because if you don't know the reason, you really don't know what the answer is here. So if it's a health reason, my child's ill, I need to take care of them, you might have the FMLA implicated, and you would go through your normal FMLA process. It might be that it's a COVID-related reason, and that would go back to the American Rescue Plan and that leave that is available if you have under 500 employees. And so the other one, the school daycares closed for COVID, that's going away a lot now, but it's still possible that it's out there, and that would fall under those temporary leave laws. Now, remember, if you're a bigger organization, you aren't covered by those. If you are a smaller organization, you may be able to use those leave laws, but again, it's optional. And so what decision have you made? Now, when we talk about it being optional, keep in mind that it's not an individual by individual basis. It doesn't mean you can pick and choose which of your employees you're going to make it available to. It means if you decide to make it available to all of your employees, okay? So don't pick and choose among employees or pick and choose among reasons. If you decide you're going to make it available, you need to honor all of the reasons that are under those leave laws. The other reason though, is that, I just don't have anybody to take care of them. I haven't made those arrangements. Well, that's not really a legitimate reason. If it's not due to COVID and it's not due to a health reason that you need to stay home and take care of them, you just haven't gotten around to making your childcare arrangements, you can actually terminate somebody. Now, again, we say be flexible, work with employees as much as you can, and document that you're doing so. That's your best practice in this pandemic time. But the way to do that in our situation is give a lot of notice, advance notice of when you're going to expect people to return. And that way they have time to try to pin these issues down. If you get into a situation though where you have to terminate an employee, whether it's because they haven't been able to make these arrangements, they haven't gotten it taken care of, or some other reason that you have to let an employee go. Maybe your situation is such that you're laying people off. We wanted to flag for you another aspect of the American Rescue Plan, and that is that it requires employers to give certain notices about an aspect of that law regarding COBRA benefits. So employers must notify employees that they've terminated that they may be eligible for some sort of subsidy. Now, the way this works out is that the employer basically pays the COBRA payment, and then the employer gets a tax credit equivalent to that so that you're not out of pocket. But the employee has to affirmatively elect that COBRA coverage. And that's why these notice requirements are so important, because they need to understand they're not going to be out of pocket if they elect COBRA. So you really want to make sure you're complying with these new notice requirements. And there are model notices available. We have an alert that's on our website. We've got the link here, but we recommend that you take a look at that. The other little trick in this is that it's not just people that you have to let go after April 1st, which is the effective date of this. Anyone who was let go in the past who's still COBRA eligible, meaning they haven't used up that generally 18-month period, whether they elected COBRA at the time or not, they have to be given a notice telling them that this exists now. And if they want to now elect, they can, and they would qualify for this. Now, this is not people who have voluntarily left. I quit my job, I retired. It's not those people, but it is people who have been terminated. Notably, it doesn't mean you were terminated as a result of COVID. That's not required. Keep that in mind. Okay. All right. Pass it back to Alyssa.
All right. And I just want to add one thing that we haven't mentioned about those leave laws under the American Rescue Plan, because I know we've got some public employers on here. That 500 employees, we keep saying, only applies to private employers. So public employers are eligible for these tax credits, no matter your size. So just to clarify that point. Okay. What if I come back and I get exposed to COVID while I'm back in the workplace? So let's talk a little bit about what the rules are right now around exposure. And this is something that if you haven't had folks back in the workplace, you're going to probably end up learning more and more about and checking every time that you have somebody test positive in your workplace. So exposed means being within 6 feet of a COVID positive person for a cumulative of 15 minutes over 24 hours. That means also, if you are wearing a mask, doesn't matter. It's just within 6 feet. It's not 3 feet. It's 6 feet. So it's a bigger berth than the distance between desks in classrooms. So what happens if somebody is exposed in the workplace? Well, they need to be excluded under CDC guidance from coming back into the workplace if they're not fully vaccinated, or if they are fully vaccinated and they have symptoms. So it's a 14-day period right now. However, this is confusing too. So just kind of want to get everybody clear on this. The CDC came out and said, well, you're allowed to shorten that 14-day period, but local health departments decide whether to shorten it. So if your health department has said it can be 10 days, or it can be 7 days if they get a test, a negative test after the 5th day, then you will have a shortened amount of time. But otherwise, it's a 14-day period that the exposed person has to be out of the workplace. So one of the big questions that I think people have gotten is, well, it's the health department's job to do the contact tracing. And that's true. It is a local health department's job to do contact tracing. However, as the employer, your job is to keep your workplace safe. And so if you have people who have been, if you have a person who tests positive for COVID, then you have an issue with safety in your workplace, and you need to determine who might have been exposed and therefore carrying the virus to others, and go ahead and exclude them. So it is in part your job with respect to the workplace to do some contact tracing and figure out where the employee who is positive has been and who they interacted with for more than 15 minutes. One thing that you can say to employees who ask this question, sort of where we started, what if I get exposed, is, look, we're not going to tell you who has COVID, but if you are exposed to COVID at work and we know about it, we will tell you that you've been exposed. And if you aren't specifically notified, then you haven't been exposed. So I think that's helpful for folks sometimes to have some comfort that you are monitoring that, and not just letting folks who have tested positive around and not worrying about it.
So I'm back up with this question. I'm back, but I have concerns about whether the workplace is safe. So you've got that employee. They came back. What do you do if they say, I'm just worried the workplace isn't safe? First off, the key is educating your employees about your COVID response plan, letting them know exactly what you're doing to keep them safe. That will help reduce the number of concerns. But then if they do say, I'm still concerned, engage with them. Engage with them and find out what is the source of their concern. If they say, well, I have a health condition, Elizabeth just walked us through that process. You're going to flip that into your ADA accommodation process. If they identify something concrete, something legitimate, you need to address it, right? Try to eliminate that or minimize that concern. But if they don't identify anything specific and they don't have a health condition, they just say, I'm just really nervous. I don't think the pandemic's over. I'm uncomfortable going outside of my home. That's not enough. You can require people to come into the workplace once we're in that stage, and it's not someone who can do their job from remotely. So once we're there, you can require them to return. But be prepared for OSHA complaints. OSHA is the group that has the ability to actually investigate concerns about workplace health and safety. Our March webinar, we talked about what one of these letters might look like and walked you through that a little bit, so I'll reference that. The other thing to keep in mind is the National Labor Relations Act. if you have someone who's saying, I'm concerned about my work environment, that could get to protected concerted activity. So educate your managers and supervisors that just because someone's raising concerns, even if it's over and over, no retaliation against them. That could be retaliation under OSHA, could be retaliation under the National Labor Relations Act. So you have to be really careful here and walk through what is the source of their concern, can it be addressed, make sure it's not a health issue, and then don't retaliate. All right, our last question, and we've got about 5 minutes left. Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, I'm vaccinated. Why do I have to wear a mask? And yeah, feel your pain, but this is a virus we still don't know a lot about. It's only been a year. There are variants out there. There is still the potential for spread indoors with vaccinated folks. You know, we just don't know that much. And the guidance hasn't changed on masking at all for workplaces. So we still need to be enforcing these mask requirements. OSHA has been very clear that you should not be treating vaccinated and unvaccinated people differently. I think that's going to continue because, especially with the fact that unvaccinated people may be unvaccinated for very personal reasons and should not be singled out or discriminated against. CDC, DHHS, they all say you still need to wear your masks. And this is, you know, masking is a mitigation measure. Vaccination is a mitigation measure. They're all there together. And so we aren't at a place where anyone who has any kind of regulatory authority or guidance has said it's safe to take off your mask in the workplace. So, you know, I know you're going to get this question, and I think it's just important to say that, you know, it just hasn't changed yet. Maybe one day, but we're not there. And keep watching as we all try to deal with this horrible pandemic. So, do we have more questions, Natalie?
All right, so we have one question that kind of goes back to asking about people, whether they've been vaccinated or not, and having those kinds of conversations and when those are needed. So let's assume they're needed. Who should be having those? You touched a little bit about supervisors and things, but what's the best practice on that?
Well, in part, this depends on the structure of your organization and how big you are. You know, I encourage folks, if they've got somebody in HR, to have HR be doing that and not the direct supervisor or the supervisor's supervisor, but have sort of a separate place so that it is a separate issue that's not related to the employee's performance, that's not related to any other employment action that might get taken. What would you say, Natalie?
Yeah, I agree with you. If there is an HR person or department, that's the best place to send those inquiries because they're going to be familiar with the ADA obligations on how to handle that information once you do have it as well, because that's a big piece of it. Even if it's okay to ask if someone's vaccinated, then you still have to treat that as confidential health information under the ADA. So they'll know how to do that. Have another question here. It is the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act and the current version of that. Is that paid? How does that work out? That's a good question because it's a little different than it used to be, isn't it?
It changed, and I don't even want to try to explain what it was before because before it was this unpaid for 2 weeks. It was just weird. Now it's easier. Okay. It's 12 weeks at 2/3 pay up to $200 a day. So there is a cap on what you can recover in terms of a tax credit. You can allow employees to supplement that 2/3 with 1/3 of their PTO day, and let them cover it that way. But there is a cap there, but it's all the same throughout the 12 weeks.
Thank you, Natalie and Elizabeth, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We will now end.